I am happy to introduce Eleanor Herman to all of you this evening. Eleanor is a New York Times bestselling historian who has written both fiction and nonfiction. She has hosted shows for the History Channel and the National Geographic Channel on Henry VIII, the ancient Greek city of Aphrodisias, and the Hindenburg. One of her past best-selling books, Sex with Kings, has been called by Kirkus Reviews as scholarly and entertaining, written with a keen eye for the politics, but never forsaking the pleasures. Her new book is called The Royal Art of Poison, Filthy Palaces, Fatal Cosmetics, Deadly Medicine, and Murder Most Foul. Using royal archives as well as modern forensic research, Herman catalogs the deadly ingredients that could be slipped into food, drink, or clothing. It's probably a good idea not to eat or drink anything right now. She describes the royal family's use of tasters to foil murder plots and their recruitment of convicts as guinea pigs for possible antidotes. Deliberately introduced or not, toxins were everywhere, and Herman paints a horrible, fascinating picture of unsanitary quarters, unwashed bodies teeming with lice, makeup laced with lead, mercury, and arsenic, and medications concocted from the renderings of freshly executed prisoners. Publishers Weekly called the book by turns fascinating and stomach churning. The books that detailed descriptions of different types of poisons will both shock and delight history buffs and enthusiasts of the macabre. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Herman.
Thank you so much, Bernard, and thank all of you for being here. It's a delight. I think it's my 5th time here at Politics and Prose. And some of you might wonder how I became interested in this particular topic, which is often a concern to my husband when we sit down to dinner. In researching my other books on royal European courts, which looked at the love affairs of kings and queens, I was struck by the prevalence of suspicions of poisoning. Now, courts were snake pits of ambition, jealousy, love affairs, and revenge, so they were really the perfect place where you would want to poison an enemy. And people in their teens, 20s, and 30s died quite often. The fact was that before modern medicine, with antibiotics, scan surgery, and anesthesia, many people died young as a result of natural causes. A cold could become pneumonia. A scratch from a rusty nail could become tetanus. And people routinely succumb to tonsillitis, appendicitis, tuberculosis, malaria, and other common ailments that are easily treated today. But back then, doctors were rarely sure exactly what had killed an individual, and there was only one sure way to determine poison as a cause of death, and that was to scrape out the stomach contents of the deceased, feed them to a small dog, and see if the dog started howling in pain and died, and then you would know it was poison. That's the stomach churning part, I think. Autopsies were performed, but physicians didn't have a clue as to what they were looking at. So that really didn't help, which is why almost any time a person died at court, even if they had been sick for a very long time, people said, it had to be poison. And this utter medical bafflement fanned the flames of fear. As a result of all this fear, royal courts developed elaborate protocols to prevent poisoning, protocols which seem very silly to us today. Unicorn horns, for instance, were valued for being able to detect poison by sweating and trembling in its presence. They were outrageously expensive, 11 times their weight in gold. Before the royal family sat down to eat, a servant solemnly waved one over the banquet table. Now, these so-called unicorn horns were actually the tusks of an Arctic whale called a narwhal, with a very strange-looking creature with one long, like an 8-foot-tall, kind of curly horn like that. And the narwhal wasn't discovered until the 18th century. Until then, Europeans marveled at the fact that all the unicorns in the world seemed to go to northern Arctic beaches to die. Now, I was surprised in my research that among these silly protocols to prevent poisoning, servants licked and kissed the king's sheets, plates, silverware, and cups to check for poison, thereby depositing their germs on everything. But they didn't know about germs until the 1870s, so I guess they didn't care. And the servants, it's hard to picture, but they even tested the king's underpants and chamber pots to make sure that there was no poison on them. So I guess they'd try on the underpants and say, "Here, Your Majesty," they feel fine. And they would actually sit on the chamber pots to make sure that, their butt didn't like flare up burning and blistering. So the great irony was, of course, that courtiers, so terrified of someone poisoning them, were actually poisoning themselves every day in 3 ways: medications, cosmetics, and environmental. This is one of the many popular recipe books available at the time to cook up home remedies and beauty treatments. This one, printed in England in 1595, was written by a Maester Alexis of Piedmont and was 350 pages long. I've read every one of them, and they're just shocking. These books and the top physicians of the time prescribed mercury for a variety of treatments, including constipation. And since mercury is poisonous, it's quite effective for that particular ailment. They also used arsenic skin creams on rashes, because arsenic kills bacteria. They didn't know about bacteria, they just knew that it worked. They used dead body parts from executed criminals in medicinal drafts, animal dung, either hot and wet or dried and powdered, for a variety of ailments. Now, the heavy metal poisons cause birth defects, kidney and liver problems, fatigue, irritability, tremors, depression, paranoia, violent mood swings, excess salivation, black teeth, and death. We all know that doctors used to bleed their patients, incorrectly believing that bleeding would remove the body's evil humors, which they thought caused all disease. The physicians of Charles II of England took 24 ounces of blood in the first few hours after his fit in 1685. George Washington was accidentally murdered by his doctor, who took 80 ounces. That's 35% of his blood in 12 hours after he came down with a bad cold. If bleeding didn't work, the doctors would cut birds in half and leave them to putrefy on your feet and your head. They thought that that might draw out these excrementitious humors that were hurting you. And curiously, the wealthy stood a greater chance of death by doctor, as fatal physicians were very expensive. And those too poor to summon a doctor relied on bed rest and chicken soup and had better odds of recovery. Now let's discuss the second cause of poisoning at royal courts: cosmetics. Maester Alexis's book offers us an astonishing recipe for a face mask of mercury, kept on the face for 8 days, moistened with steam and rubbed off with bread. Now, it is likely the toxic makeup sickened and killed many court ladies who were quite literally dying to be beautiful. Queen Elizabeth I, pictured here, though she lived to be 69, which was fairly ancient for the time, wore a mask of poisonous cosmetics for over 40 years to cover up smallpox scars she got when she was 29. Her white foundation was a mixture of mercury, lead, vinegar, and a bit of arsenic. She would have worn arsenic face powder over the foundation and colored her cheeks and lips with vermilion powdered cinnabar, which contained mercury. These ingredients would have resulted in hair loss, muscle paralysis, mood disorders, and declining mental acuity. Ironically, this makeup also corroded the skin, leaving blotches and pits, so the user had to pile on more to cover up the additional damage, creating a never-ending cycle of skin damage and poison. I have heard one report that Elizabeth didn't wash her makeup off before bed and just plastered on more every day, and upon her death it was an inch thick. Her red wigs were dyed with safflower petals and sulfur. And unfortunately, sulfur, too, is highly toxic, and it causes headaches, nausea, and nosebleeds. So here we can see the chalk white lead and arsenic face, the mercury lips, and the nosebleed wig. During the last years of her life, Elizabeth lost her appetite, and she deteriorated mentally and physically, suffering depression and mood swings, symptoms of chronic heavy metal poisoning, though at the time, courtiers thought she was just getting old and crotchety. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know if she suffered heavy metal poisoning, as researchers are not allowed to crack open her casket below Westminster Abbey and test her bones because the royal family of Great Britain is afraid of DNA testing, and probably with good reason, considering that their status in life is based on heredity. Diane De Poitiers was the scintillating mistress of King Henri II of France, and oddly, she was 19 years older than her royal lover, and in the age before Botox, took extraordinary measures to ensure a youthful appearance. She exercised like a fiend, wore a black velvet mask whenever she stepped outside, bathed in ass's milk to keep her skin soft, and drank a potion of liquid gold. Physicians believed that gold had magical qualities, and since gold never tarnishes or ages, if you ingested it, you wouldn't tarnish or age either. Unfortunately, ingesting large amounts of gold is quite poisonous. It kills red blood cells, which must have given Diane a fashionably white complexion, and causes brittle bones, and we know she broke her leg twice. It also causes thin hair. Researchers examined a lock of her hair and found it to be extremely thin, and inflamed kidneys and intestines. So instead of taking her gold youth potion once a month, as Maester Alexis recommended in his book, poor Diane, desperately clinging to the last shreds of youth, drank it every day. She died in 1566 at the age of 66, and when French researchers discovered her body in 2008, they were shocked to find large amounts of gold saturating the ground beneath her. In short, it was what had killed her. The third kind of poison at royal courts was environmental. The palaces themselves, and this is a chamber at Versailles, gloriously beautiful though they were pits of filth and infection and dominions of dung. Inside the lacquered cabinets and gilded rooms were overflowing chamber pots brimming with parasites and bacteria. Now, shockingly, some courtiers didn't even bother to go find a chamber pot. They just dropped their breeches and did their business wherever. When the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza, who had led a sheltered and pious existence, arrived in England to marry King Charles II in 1661, she and her ladies were horrified to find men blithely urinating throughout the palace. The ladies complained that they cannot stir abroad without seeing in every corner great beastly English pricks battering against every wall. A 1675 report on the Louvre in Paris claimed that on the grand staircases, behind the doors, and almost everywhere, one sees there a mass of excrement. One smells 1,000 unbearable stenches caused by calls of nature, which everyone goes to do there every day. Many of you history lovers are probably aware that royal courts moved from palace to palace fairly frequently. Henry VIII would go from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle to Greenwich Palace, often completing 30 moves a year, with thousands of courtiers and servants in tow and all of their furniture. Now, the reason courts traveled around so much was not for a change of scenery. It was to allow the servants who stayed behind to scrub off all the excrement and urine off the floors, walls, and fireplaces. We have determined that human waste was pretty much everywhere in a palace, and we must not forget about animal dung. Horses, cows, pigs, goats, dogs, cats, chickens, and rats were ever present, and so was their waste. The huge amounts of human and animal waste, in addition to being unhealthful in the palace, caused problems for the general water supply, as the waste and its bacteria leached into the groundwater, and it ended up in wells and rivers. Mozart's mother, Anna Maria, died in 1778 after drinking Seine river water in Paris. Polluted water, in addition to causing fatal dysentery, which can dehydrate you so quickly you resemble a corn husk in a few hours, it also caused people to develop intestinal worms. The remains of two 15th century individuals, King Richard III of England and French royal mistress Agnes Sorel, were found to have large infestations of roundworms, which grow up to a foot long. and periodically you would cough them up alive. Being in such close proximity to all these different kinds of animals also caused epidemics such as anthrax to jump into the human population, sometimes killing thousands at a time. So in terms of food, bear in mind there were no food inspectors, there's no refrigeration, no thermometers to see if your food has been properly cooked, and plenty of animals in the kitchens. There were mice and rats trying to nab crumbs of food, cats to chase away the mice, dogs to turn the meat spit, and as a result, the kitchens had fur waste and fleas. Now, cooking meat in a hearth, and I know this because I've actually done it. I took a Renaissance cooking class. It results in some parts being rather raw and other parts being sort of burnt. And from the raw parts, you could get bacteria. So food poisoning before the advent of an IV drip could kill you from dehydration in a few hours. And it has the identical symptoms of arsenic poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach pain, and muscle cramps, except for one thing. And this they didn't know until maybe 100 years ago. Food poisoning causes a fever. Arsenic poisoning does not. So hundreds of years ago, no one knew that. If you got sick with food poisoning, they'd say, oh my God, someone put arsenic in her food. Those gorgeous palace walls themselves could make you sick. Walls painted red, quite a fashionable color in the 17th and 18th centuries, were made from mercury or arsenic sulfide. White paint was made from lead, yellow from arsenic sulfide. Starting in the 18th century, green walls exuded pure arsenic, sickening and killing countless people. And let us not forget the courtiers themselves, resplendent in gorgeous attire and sparkling with gemstones. Most of them must have smelled horrible, as doctors told them washing could kill them. According to a popular medical advice book from the 16th century, use not baths or stews, nor sweat too much, for all openeth the pores of a man's body, and maketh the venomous air for to enter and for to infect the blood. It seems that King James I, pictured here in ermine and silk, never washed any part of his body and was crawling with lice. Some court ladies complained that they became lousy by sitting in a counselor's chamber that James had just left. So bathing was considered so dangerous that many courtiers consulted with their astrologers to find out the most auspicious day for taking a bath. Should it be 6 months from now when the moon is in Uranus, or should it be 8 months from now? So that's really how dirty they were. Now, in this book, I investigated the suspicious deaths of 20 individuals at royal courts to ascertain whether they were poisoned or not, knowing what we do now about all of these other causes of deaths of young people. So let's look at some of the cases I examined. In July 1329, 38-year-old Congrande della Scala, an Italian warlord, made his state entry into the northern Italian city of Treviso, which he had just conquered. He wasn't feeling well during the procession and was glad to slide off his horse and take to his bed. He had a fever, vomiting, and diarrhea, which he blamed on drinking from a polluted spring, which must have meant that it had been befouled with the waste of soldiers and animals, which was quite common for an army on the march. 4 days later, he was dead, and rumors of arsenic poisoning abounded. His nephew and heir had his doctor hanged, though we're not sure why. Was it because he had killed Congrande, or was it because he hadn't been able to save him? So for centuries, historians thought that either dysentery or perhaps malaria had felled the strapping warrior in the prime of his life. Then in 2004, a team of Italian researchers from the University of Pisa cracked open his ornate tomb in Verona to confirm or refute the rumor of arsenic poisoning. And they were shocked to see the condition of the body. It was no sad heap of rotten bones, which a lot of times you can't get very much information from, but it was a natural mummy with intact flesh and remarkably preserved organs. The liver, stomach, intestines, all of that was intact. A great boon for determining whether he had died of natural illness or poison. So researchers discovered lower than average arsenic levels. So the old rumor of arsenic poison was clearly false. But they found, mixed in with what must have been a healing tea used to treat fever of chamomile and black mulberry, extraordinarily high levels of digitalis, the foxglove plant, which everybody knew was toxic. The digitalis was clearly what had killed Congrande, but it doesn't explain his fever because digitalis doesn't cause fever. It seems he had a natural illness from the polluted water, from which he may very well have recovered, and his doctor had been bribed to put poison in his medications. People trusted their doctors, and tasters never tested medication. The doctor would grind it up, mix it up, give it to you, you would drink it. So the sick king, or in this case the warlord, would just take what the doctor gave them. And of all these people I researched, the 4 that were poisoned, they were all poisoned by their doctors. In 1815, after losing the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic called St. Helena. He took with him a few brave and loyal aides and 1,500 books because he was afraid he would die of boredom. Now, throughout his life, Napoleon had enjoyed excellent health. He exercised regularly, drank alcohol in moderation, and unusual for his time, he scrubbed himself in a hot bath every morning. Even on his military campaigns, which is why he carted around a bathtub with the army. Perhaps his wisest steps in staying healthy, however, was keeping far away from doctors. Whenever he met a physician, his first question was invariably, "Monsieur, how many patients have you killed in your practice?" It's a good question, we now know. He rarely, if ever, took any medication or submitted to bleeding, puking, and purging. On September 20th, 1817, for the first time, he complained of a dull pain in the area of the torso, roughly parallel to his right elbow. His symptoms included nausea, vomiting, sleeplessness, constipation, and depression, and he lost more than 20 pounds as the pain spread over his entire abdomen. When his Italian doctor, Francois Carlo Antomarchi, urged him to take some medications, Napoleon snorted, "Keep your medications, monsieur. I do not want to have 2 diseases, the one I have already and the one you will give me." He was smart. So the illness worsened with horrifying pain, and on April 15th, 1821, he wrote in his will, "I die prematurely, assassinated by the English oligarchy and its hired killer. The English nation will not be slow in avenging me." So he seemed to think he was being poisoned. On the night of May 4th, he mumbled about France, the army, and his dead ex-wife, Josephine. The following day, he fell into a coma, and he died at the age of 51. Now, the European powers were terrified that if rumors got out that Napoleon had been poisoned, revolutions would spring up across the continent, as he was still quite popular, and most people hated the kings who had replaced Napoleon and his family members. So his autopsy was very important. It revealed a cancerous tumor covering almost his entire stomach, and indeed, Napoleon's father had died of stomach cancer at the age of 38. And this cancer had probably started from a gastric ulcer. 6 to 9% of cases of untreated gastric ulcers will develop into stomach cancer. So there they left it, and everyone accepted it. In the 1960s, however, a Swedish dentist and Napoleon buff studying Napoleon's illness recognized 22 out of 30 symptoms of arsenic poisoning. He obtained several locks of Napoleon's hair from his time on St. Helena. The emperor had given locks of hair to friends and visitors, which was the custom of the time. And he had these tested. They revealed arsenic content up to 100 times the normal amount throughout the hair, not just at the root, which would be the 2-3 days before he died, but for months. Proof of slow chronic poisoning, the Swedish dentist believed, designed to make it look as if the emperor was dying slowly of an illness. So perhaps he did die of arsenic poisoning, and though there was cancer, it wouldn't have killed him, or not yet. However, after this initial research, Napoleon's hair from his pre-St. Helena days, going back to childhood, was tested by research institutes around the world. Always he had arsenic levels about 100 times normal. So how did the arsenic get in his hair? Because he was a stickler for hygiene, I believe that since childhood, he used an arsenic-based hair tonic to prevent lice infestations. As I said, a tiny bit of arsenic mixed in a cream kills critters much faster than it could harm a human being. So it was effective and widely used. And with being with the army as often as he was, with all of the lice, it is likely that he used this. Now, some people may have gotten sick over time, depending on their genetics and a lot of other things going on, but this arsenic hair cream never seemed to have hurt Napoleon. He had strong constitution, healthy lifestyle, and good genes. He probably built up a tolerance to it. So let's take a brief look at some of the other figures I investigate in the book. In 1572, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, the leader of the Huguenots in France, went shopping with her arch-enemy, Queen Catherine de Medici, who was Catholic, tried on a pair of gloves, immediately felt sick, and died 4 days later. Had the gloves been drenched in poison by the Catholic Queen? Now, John's death, coming when it did, set in motion a chain of events leading up to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when Catholics killed thousands of innocent Huguenots. And everyone kind of points back to those poisoned gloves. In 1601, after dining at a banquet in Prague, the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe became ill and died in agony 11 days later. Did his assistant, Johannes Kepler, poison him with mercury to steal his 40 years of astronomical observations? Well, scientists dug up Tycho a few years ago. I was working with one in Denmark who did, and now we have the answer. In 1553, the bright and athletic boy king, Edward VI, son and heir of Henry VIII, died mysteriously and horribly, age 15, swollen and bruised. His fingernails and toenails had turned black and fallen off. Had he been poisoned to make way for the Puritan Lady Jane Grey or the Catholic Mary Tudor to take the throne? Most people believed he had been poisoned over a period of months to make it look like an illness and create an opportunity for regime change. Henrietta Stuart, Duchess d'Orléans, was the beloved younger sister of Charles II of England, and she became the sister-in-law of Louis XIV of France by marrying his younger brother, Philippe. Theirs was a tumultuous marriage, as they both had numerous affairs with men, sometimes with the same men, which was really quite confusing. In 1670, at the age of 26, she played a role in exiling her husband's favorite lover, the love of his life, the dashing Chevalier de Lorraine. One day, she drank a cup of chicory water, clutched her side, and cried loudly, "I am poisoned!" And she died after 9 hours of agony. The autopsy, witnessed by dozens of noblemen and the English ambassador, indicated arsenic poisoning, though of course the French doctors denied it. And her death almost caused a war between France and England. More recently, scientists have discovered where there was truth to the rumor that her furious husband had killed her. In 1599, Gabrielle d'Estrées, the beautiful mistress of King Henry IV of France, pregnant with her fourth child, was set to marry the king on Easter Sunday and become Queen of France. She'd been his mistress for about 8 years. And many people were shocked that they would be having a whore as queen. When she died a shockingly gruesome and mysterious death, only 36 hours before her wedding and coronation, everyone agreed that she had been poisoned. But was she? We have the answer. In 1791, 35-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died after a 10-day illness, during which he suffered a high fever, swelled up grotesquely, and gave off a horrifying stench. Fingers pointed immediately to his musical rival at the Habsburg court in Vienna, Antonio Salieri, if any of you saw that wonderful 1984 movie, Amadeus, as having poisoned him with arsenic in a fit of musical jealousy. What killed the world's most talented composer? Well, we have an answer to that. In the 19th century, scientific advances reduced the fear of poison. In 1836, a British scientist named James Marsh, pictured here, discovered a reliable test for arsenic poisoning, and tests for all kinds of other poisons followed shortly after that. And advances in medical science resulted in clear, accurate diagnoses of most illnesses and causes of death. So the ignorance-fueled fear that spread rumors of poison was quieted by science. So you might think poison is a thing of the past. Unfortunately, poison did not vanish with the royals of centuries ago. In recent decades, the Soviet Union and now Russia have poisoned dissidents, activists, journalists, and more recently, a former spy. Indeed, instead of holding a unicorn horn over their food, Russians who rouse the ire of Vladimir Putin would be well advised to hold a Geiger counter over their meals. In 2004, 50-year-old Viktor Yushchenko was running for president of Ukraine, and he was very heavily pro-West, pro-NATO, against Russia, fighting for political corruption, freedom of the press, and fighting corruption. His opponent in the race was closely allied with Russia. On September 5th, in the final weeks of a bitter and sometimes violent campaign, Yushchenko ate soup with a group of senior Ukrainian officials and almost immediately became deathly ill. He was flown to a Viennese hospital where doctors found he had acute pancreatitis, chloracne in his face, that's what all those marks are, swollen and pockmarked, and a serious viral infection. They also discovered in his blood levels of TCCD, a chemical compound also known as dioxin, 6,000 times above normal, though they estimated when he first got sick, he had had 50,000 times the normal amount. An ingredient in Agent Orange, it is 170,000 times more poisonous than cyanide. Because of the extraordinary medical measures taken to save him, he did survive, but look at the difference in his appearance. They did work on the face. Oddly enough, those marks on his face, they were surrounding the poison, so the poison was in his skin and not in his liver, and this awful appearance probably saved his life. He does look better now, but he will never regain his good looks. Researchers concluded that the poison was so pure it was definitely made in a laboratory. And when Yushchenko pointed the finger at Russia for poisoning him, the Russians accused him of poisoning himself in an effort to win sympathy and votes. And it worked. He won, but look at him. Alexander Litvinenko was a former Russian intelligence officer who fled to Great Britain, where he wrote articles and books highly critical of Vladimir Putin. In 2006, Litvinenko met at a London hotel with two former KGB officers, and later that day fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea. Doctors eventually determined he had been poisoned with polonium-210, 1 million times more poisonous than cyanide. This substance emits radioactive particles that tear cells apart, destroying the immune system and causing catastrophic organ failure. And tests showed a staggering amount of polonium-210 in his samples, 200 times the amount needed to kill him. So polonium-210 can only be produced in state-regulated nuclear reactors, and the dose that poisoned Litvinenko has since been traced back to a Russian nuclear power plant. What a surprise. Investigators collecting evidence at the hotel where Litvinenko met with the men found a teapot with off-the-charts levels of polonium. And when he died, his body was so radioactive, doctors waited a week before performing the autopsy in hazmat suits. In January 2016, a thorough UK investigation found that the two KGB officers had poisoned him and had likely been acting under the instructions of the FSB and Vladimir Putin, a finding, of course, that Russia vehemently denies. So there have been many, many more cases of Russian state-sponsored poisoning, but let's bring it up to date with this final one. On the afternoon of March 14, 2018, so only 3 months ago, in Salisbury, England, a doctor and nurse were walking through a park, and they noticed two people slumped over on a bench. Paramedics quickly arrived and took the couple to the hospital, where they were identified as 66-year-old Sergei Skripal, an expat Russian, and his 33-year-old daughter Yulia, who had just come the night before to visit him from Moscow. Authorities soon determined they had been poisoned with a nerve agent called Novichok, a type designed and manufactured only in Russia. Sergei Skripal was a former Russian military intelligence officer who had started working in the 1990s as a double agent for the UK's, the MI6 intelligence agency, the James Bond one. He passed Russian state secrets onto the Brits, including the names of 300 Russian agents. In 2004, he was arrested in Russia for high treason, found guilty, and sentenced to 13 years in prison. However, in 2010, Skripal and 3 other Russians were swapped for 10 Russian spies imprisoned in the US, and he settled into the medieval English town of Salisbury. So British investigators determined that this Novichok agent, which is developed and manufactured only in Russia, causes catastrophic respiratory and heart failure, had been smeared on the front doorknob of Sergei Skripal's house. As a matter of fact, he touched it, his daughter touched it, and when the policemen, who they found their ID on the bench, they wanted to go in and see what's going on in the house, or there are other family members that should be notified or what, he touched it, and he was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. So Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning and accused Britain of planting the Novichok on the doorknob to besmirch Russia's international reputation. The Russian government has accused the UK of holding the two Russian nationals against their will. And surprisingly, neither one wants to meet with Russian government officials. I just can't imagine why. Both nations have sent each other's diplomats packing. And surprisingly, Yulia recovered and was released from the hospital in April. Her father a month later. How did the pair survive this devastating nerve agent? Medical experts attributed their recovery to the readily available treatments and antidotes they received at the hospital almost right away, within minutes. So they're now in a kind of witness protection program and will probably need to spend the rest of their lives in hiding. What happens sometimes if Russia can't get you with poison, because poison is always a little tricky. It offers the advantages of stealth. No one, for instance, knows who did this to the Skripal house. But it's not 100% sure. So in some cases, they'll come back and get you with a hail of bullets. And the odd thing is, last week I got a book contract for this book to be translated into Russian from the top Russian nonfiction publisher. And I was scratching my head. I thought, of all the different languages, like it would never be Russian, right? And I emailed my agent, and I said, Stephen, are you sure they read the last chapter? And I told my husband, Michael, and he said, well, maybe they want to publish it and use it as an instruction manual. So poison has been around, as we have seen, for a very long time. It offers the advantages of stealth and a long lead getaway, but it can be a tricky business. Now, many victims these days survive if they receive rapid and aggressive medical intervention, as in the case of Viktor Yushchenko and the Skripals. Whatever the case, it is likely that poison will always be with us. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions. The question was, which is the most painful poison? I think the radioactive poisons have got to be the most painful. I mean, if you've ever had food poisoning, okay, that would be what arsenic poisoning is like. It's no joke. It's not pleasant. But I think the radioactive poisons that start tearing away at the cells of your liver and heart and everything else, that just must be horrible.
Eleanor, this is partly in jest, but partly a real concern. Are you going into the witness protection program after writing that final chapter? I'm half serious about that.
Well, it's in my research. I found that Vladimir Putin is very sensitive to what he considers to be treason from Russian nationals. Nice. So if I had been born and raised in Russia and was writing this book, I think I might be, I don't know. But as an American citizen, and I always write, Russia has denied this and Russia has denied that, which is a fact. So I allow them to say their piece there. But if that publisher asked me to do a book tour through Russia, I don't know. Because now how am I going to touch the doorknob at my hotel?
I wouldn't go to Ukraine either.
Yeah, maybe not. Yes, please, everybody go up. You can wait at one of the microphones.
So clearly arsenic poisoning was like, everyone knew about it, or people were very concerned about it, but they also used it in so many things. So was there any sort of idea in the culture, I guess, that was wrong? Because clearly when people died, they were like, oh, they were poisoned. So, but they used them seemingly.
No, that's an excellent question. Bear in mind, there were no scientific tests for anything, and everything they did was trial and error. I guess when someone died, that was the error. So they knew that large amounts of arsenic, and sometimes it was mixed in with like mercury sublimate and other poisons, in their wine or something, like a big dose of that would be fatal. That's what they were worried about. But they also knew, if you had syphilis or if you had a really grungy skin rash, that we know now would be caused by bacteria, and so was syphilis, right? So you take a tiny bit of arsenic and mix it in with some other, and they had, egg yolks and all this different stuff, and I've read the recipes, and then you apply that to the eruptions on your skin, and the next day it looks a lot better. So they thought that, just a little bit of it wouldn't hurt. And just like with your cosmetics, the lead, mercury, and arsenic, it was little amounts, and you weren't, you didn't get sick immediately. I mean, Queen Elizabeth, it took her 40 years, before she even died. So they really didn't know that it was hurting people, in other words. Yes.
Yeah, you spoke about the unsanitary conditions in the medieval Renaissance courts and palaces. So I'm just wondering, do you know anything about the domestic households that people go around and pee everywhere too?
I think it was a certain amount of arrogance. I mean, I was surprised to read about this. You always think everyone's dressed like this, right? They look magnificent. They wouldn't just, go pee in the main corridor of Versailles. I think it was an arrogance that they figured out that the servants would just clean it up. But the servants are like, I'm not cleaning that up, and so it would just stay there until they left. And then they have a special cleaning crew. I picture them in 16th century hazmat suits coming in to clean this up. I think if you were a nobleman, a count or a duke or something, you just thought you were too good for anything, and you would just do whatever you wanted.
So it's not that there was necessarily a lack of hygiene universally in that respect.
Well, no, I think there was, because once the main ballroom of Versailles is filled with urine, you might figure, well, why should I go looking for a chamber pot?
Thank you, Eleanor. That was fabulous. As always, you're wonderful. I was wondering, what led you into writing a book about this? It's great, but who would have thought of the royal art of poison except Eleanor? Did I miss the opening?
Yeah,
which
the
you'd explained
opening, and a lot of people did.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm glad you asked. So, I wrote Sex with Kings and Sex with the Queen, and I'm reading stories about all these people in royal courts, and someone died at 18 with a stomach ache, and someone died at 25, and they'd say, they were poisoned, and there was usually someone who stood to benefit. Either they would inherit, or they'd get to marry the prince, or something. And so I thought, I kind of set that aside, and I thought one day I really want to come back and look at the whole poisoning thing. And as I started researching it, I found that they were poisoning themselves. With their cosmetics and the filthy hygiene, and then the doctors would kill you with poison. And so there were poisons everywhere at court, but, most of them were self-imposed. Yeah, that was the irony of it.
Hey, Eleanor. So I'm absolutely amazed at the investigation and the sources of information. How did you do that? How did you know who to contact in Paris or in Italy or wherever?
Well, I'm fluent in French, German, and Italian. And it used to be, when I first started writing these books 12 or 15 years ago, I would have to get on a plane and go to Germany or France and, put on the cotton gloves and go to the archives. And, and so it was much more time-consuming and expensive. Well, this time around, I get online. Like the Maester Alexis book, that's online. I printed it out for free. So there's all of this wonderful material that's there. And then, just a Google search, like they dug up Tycho Brahe. Well, if you are a researcher at a university, your email is publicly available. So I contacted this guy. Hey, I heard you dug up old Tycho. Did you find mercury in his bones? I'm writing a book. And he actually got back to me. So did researchers all over the world. So I was very lucky that they took the time to help me.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Yes, Jeffrey.
Well, just wondering, when you pick a subject, is it easy for you, or do you just decide, well, this is very interesting, I think I'll write a book about it, or do you go to several people and say, do you think this would be a good idea? Do you have any ideas what I should write about?
No, I never ask anyone else's opinion. Well, other than my agent, because he's the one that's going to have to go out there and sell it. Yeah, but I think as an author, and you're an author too, Jeffrey, we all have to have a strong sense of where our passion is. If someone told me to write a book about, I don't know, the history of computers or something, oh my God, I couldn't. I would just be so bored. So, I like sex, I like murder, I like, it's got to be something that, is really fun and interesting for me. And I really like the humorous angles as well. I asked my husband, because I was reading a review, do you think I have an acerbic wit? And he just rolled his eyes like, a little bit? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I like crime.
Yes, you like crime. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. There's no one at that one.
I know. Thanks for dressing up.
Thank you.
Makes it all the more fun. Is this the first book that's been that you've been approached to translate into Russian, or were the others? And if it's the first, and if your publisher wants to go ahead and do it, do you have the right to say no? And
Oh, yes, I always have the right to say no.
Yeah.
But that'd be saying no to like a fat check. And if they want to read about how their president is murdering journalists and activists, I don't think I should stand in their way.
Okay.
Because you have to sign separate contracts with each publisher. So if you get a French publisher, a Spanish publisher, you have to sign the contract. Mm-hmm. And everything is listed in it. How much money are they going to pay and when and that kind of thing. So I would have the right to say no. But and your first question, I have sold, I think all of my history books have been sold to Russia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
I was just surprised this one sold.
So this one would be on the black market, right?
Yes. Somebody's going to be making a lot of money off of this, I guess. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. On some of these people you mentioned, you said there's an answer to that regarding their deaths. Could you share some of those answers?
Okay, but you really have to get the book if you want like all.
just one or two juicy ones.
Okay, so when you're looking at someone who died and everyone said, oh, they were poisoned, you need to look at what were the symptoms leading up to it. Had they had stomach aches for 2 years, that would be, had they been coughing for 2 years, that could be tuberculosis that finally got them. Had they had a miscarriage and had continual gynecological problems, and so you need to look at that. And then also, most of these people are really famous. So in the past 100, 130 years, doctors now know how the body works and that kind of thing. And so there have been reports in medical journals about what probably killed many of these people. Yeah. Oh, and the other thing I want to say, most of these people had autopsies. If you were rich, famous, royal, they did an autopsy. And so, and the doctors love to go poking around dead royal bodies, and they go, well, here's the liver, and they'd write down, it looks blighted. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. The lungs are a little, they're a little too red but they didn't know what it meant. These days, doctors can look at this, black liver, red lungs, we know that's blah, 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 right? So that's why the autopsy, and I've read all of these autopsies, and I learned how to do a Renaissance autopsy, which is not for the faint of heart. They didn't have IVs, and they would like slash and squeeze the blood out, and then they would stuff the guts with with thyme and rosemary, and it's sort of like stuffing a chicken, and then sew it all up and stick it in the, So anyway, we have all of these reports, which are very helpful for the researchers. Thank you. Yeah, you probably saw you asked that question at this point.
Eleanor.
Yeah.
This is so fascinating and so creepy at the same time.
I know. Booklist said that it's a pernicious history that will make jaws drop and pages fly.
Well, amen. I'm ready for your talk show, your movie, your cable show. With all these fascinating cast of characters, was there one in particular that spoke to your heart or that you felt connected to?
Yeah, it was the kids, really. They're, the 15-year-old son of Henry VIII. He lost his mother at birth. He lost his father when he was 9. And he was a very smart, good little boy, hardworking and athletic, and he loved the Bible. You know, there was so much religious stuff going on that he was hoping to just settle on a religion for England and stop all this. And he just started to cough, you see. And first of all, he got measles. And then he started to cough. And there was a correlation as to why he was coughing 6 months after the measles, which doctors now understand. But he had a horrendous, no painkillers. And, I don't know, 5 months of just agony before he died. And and then there was the young heir to the throne of England in 1612, Prince Henry. He was 18. And he was handsome and athletic and good, and he got a horrible it took him a month to die. But when you see the future of a nation, someone who's bright and good looking and kind and studious, and that they just have this disgusting and painful death, those really gripped me.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. We've all heard stories about Catherine de Medici.
Yes.
Did she really poison a lot of people?
So Catherine de Medici was an Italian duchess, actually, and she was the Pope's niece. And in 1533, she went to marry the second son of the King of France. And what happened was the first son was poisoned, they thought. And so suddenly she's going to be the new queen, and she was, and her husband died, and so she sort of ruled the roost for many years. Now, we know that in Tuscany and in the Venetian Republic, there were poison factories. There were like labs, universities, let's say, where you would experiment with poisons on mostly on condemned criminals. So if you were going to hang because you had murdered somebody, they'd say, "Hey, Joe Motherall, you can either hang tomorrow or you can volunteer by taking this poison, and then we'll give you an antidote and see if it works. If it works, you're off scot-free. You get to go home. Oh. If it doesn't, you might wish that you had gotten hanged, but do you want to take the chance?" So anyway, Italy was very big into this. I have not found any records that Spain was, we think, but there's no good records really. There's just some mentions. France, England, they thought that anybody who was going to poison you had to be an Italian. So poor Catherine had that reputation. She went there, she was 14, right? And she brings a perfumer who's an Italian guy who cooks up stuff in the laboratory, to make, nice perfumes and cosmetics. Well, everyone knew that guy was a poisoner. And he was the one who made the gloves for the Huguenot queen. And that's why oh my God, the Italian glove maker poisoned the Protestant queen. So really, I think she had a very bad reputation. I don't think she murdered anybody. I really don't. Okay. Yeah, good question. Now, I'm afraid maybe we'll go to someone else instead of my husband. What is he going to add?
Should your husband be worried about anything? Yeah, I wonder if you could share, Eleanor, this relationship you have with the doctor in Baltimore and the symposium.
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful story. So 20 years ago, I started reading in the paper. There was a clinico-pathological medical conference in Baltimore. And every year, the University of Maryland Medical School down in the harbor would pick a historical figure like Edgar Allan Poe or Alexander the Great, where you have a list of symptoms of the death, but nobody knows how these people died. And they were very famous people, so that the doctors would go over everything at this conference, and then they would pick, what they thought had killed them. So I've been reading this year after year, and when I sat down to write this book, I realized I knew nothing about medicine. I was raised as a Christian Scientist, for Christ's sake. We never went to the doctor. And to prevent me from committing, medical literary malpractice, I needed a doctor to work with me. So, there again, all of the physicians have their emails online. at the hospital. So I sent him an email, Dr. Bakowiak, I've been looking at your conferences for 20 years. I'm writing this book. I need someone to please, read it and make sure I'm getting things right. And he and I have become really close friends. I mean, he said, sure. Who says sure, right? I mean, it was a lot of work, and he was amazing. And I acknowledge him in the acknowledgments a great bit. I tell the whole story. So thank you. That's a special friendship. I helped him with his book he wrote, and yeah. So any other questions about poisonings?
What are you going to write about next time?
Well, I enjoy stories of sex, power, and murder, and there are just so many. It's going to be rather hard to, especially when you look around D.C. these days. Maybe I won't have to go so far for my research. I could just sort of stay in town here and look around. Is that it? Are there any other questions? Okay.